Greetings, everyone. My name is Peter Young, and I am part of the volunteer team of people who the Yale Career Panels and Yale Career Fireside Chats. I want to welcome you for this session on a candid view of the legal profession. Before I introduce our speakers and we start our fireside chat discussion, I want to give you a little bit of history. This all started because 9.5 years ago, a number of us noticed that although the Yale students are very educated and very smart, that they often had really distorted information about different careers. And we just decided, let's try to solve the problem. So we started the Yale Career Panels candid view of different professions. And the first one actually was legal. And we had one on legal, and it was very popular. And the whole idea is actually not to persuade you to go into a profession or not go into a profession, rather to arm you with the information that will help you understand kind of a balanced view of the pros and cons and so forth. Because it's all a question of really personal fit. No profession that is necessarily better or worse than others. It's really a question of what matches you personally. The one thing this series won't do is it won't help you understand yourself. And that one of the things I would encourage you to do is do a good job of self-assessment. Get a friend or some colleagues who know you well enough, but also willing to be honest with you and say, no, you're really not that blank or X or Y, because that's really important for you in terms of saying, you know, how do I match a particular profession, right? If you have a short attention span, you shouldn't be a professor and take 4 years to write a book because it just won't work. So that's the goal. And second, I want to really acknowledge Trish Takimoto, who was a co-founder back in 2012, who in fact is the one who assembled this panel. And I'm very pleased that she got a very wonderful and very diverse panel. And also Justin Conslin and Julie Son, who are part of our volunteer group of people running the Yale Career Panels, along with help from Yale, the Alumni Association, and the School Office of Career Strategies. So the last thing I want to say is just to say that there is a website called yalecareerpanels.com, and on that it describes the program, but it also has a list of all the previous career panels, and this is actually the 49th. And the link to most of them have been recorded. So if you want to watch the one on architecture or drama and film or music, you can watch it. And that's the beauty of having things recorded. And this will be recorded. If you want to watch it repeatedly, like Netflix, because you enjoyed it so much, in a day or so, we'll be able to tell you what the link is. The last thing I want to say is that we're going to take the first 40 minutes and do the panel and the fireside chat, but we're going to leave 10 or 15 minutes at the end for questions. And under this platform, the way you ask questions is through the chat function. And so I think everyone is familiar with the chat box. Just click on chat and type in your questions. The panelists and I, as the moderator, will be able to read the questions, and we'll try to get through them as many as we can. The last thing, and the reason why this is a different platform, is we chose to use this one because at the end of the panel, all of you will be magically transported into an electronic ballroom with tables of 8, and when you can, it'll be like you're hovering above a ballroom, and you can see all the tables, and you can see who's at each table. And each of the panelists have agreed to stay at least for 30 minutes, and they are at each table. So Peggy quote, there's a Peggy quote table, etc. And you can go and just sit down and chat with them. And when you sit down, it'll be like a Zoom session where you can see everyone at the table and talk. And if you get tired of a table, you can go to another table. Or if you don't want to talk to the panelists, there are empty tables where you can just work and meet other people who are attendees. So with that, we'll get started. So first of all, we have a wonderful group here. Henry Chen is a director and counsel at American Express. And I think if you read his description of what he does, it's really fascinating and really, part of what's the cutting edge these days on digital, et cetera. Peggy Kuo, when I first met her, she was not a judge, but she's really, starting from her work with the International Tribunal and so forth, really been dedicated to the judicial system and justice. And so she's a wonderful representative of that part of the legal profession. And Joanna is a counsel in the democracy program at the Brennan Center for Justice. And actually, this is the first time we've had someone from a nonprofit on the legal side participate, which is a very, very important part, because all these nonprofits, they too have a legal function that's very important for their missions. So with that, let's get started. So I think the first question is really this, which is, how did you get into the profession, and what's a typical career path for the part of the legal profession that you're in? And I'll let, I guess we'll do alphabetically initially. Henry, do you want to comment?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Peter. I could talk a little bit about my career path. After finishing law school, I went into private practice for a good amount of time. I was actually in private practice for about 10 years, which just means I was practicing in a law firm. And, for those of you who are, interested in the profession or just starting out, the reason a lot of law school graduates start practice within a law firm is because you get a great amount of training there. After practicing in intellectual property law for about 10 years, I decided to go in-house, which just means I went to a company and served as the legal counsel for that particular company. I did that at two different locations. First, technology startup for about 1.5 years, and then I transitioned over to Amex about 2 years ago. So for in-house attorneys, I would say it is fairly typical to start out in private practice for the reasons I mentioned, because you get a lot of great training in a law firm. And typically when you join an in-house legal department, it's normally not as big as a law firm. And, there's I would say there's more of an expectation that when you show up in-house, you bring a certain set of skills with you that you're able to provide to the company that you're working for. They'll typically hire you for a particular reason. And so you don't have that kind of long runway to learn a new practice. I would say that's typical for in-house attorneys, although some do start out directly there after law school. But that's how I got into the profession. I'm happy to answer any questions one may have about kind of the process for doing that.
So Peggy, tell me about your career. Yeah, I'll tell you one thing for sure. It's been clear from the beginning what you're interested in, so that's good, right? And have a passion. So Peggy, you want to share with us sort of how you got into where you were and your career path?
Sure, Peter. Usually people say my career, my resume shows I don't know what I'm interested in because I've ended up doing so many things. But you're absolutely right. The thing that I've been, that ties all the different things I've done together is a sense of justice and a desire to really contribute to that discussion and that journey toward justice. I don't know whether my path is typical. I don't know that there is a typical path these days to the judiciary, because there is an effort being made to diversify the types of backgrounds that judges bring to the bench. I can say that for me, what drove my career, at least in the early age, was the desire to be in the courtroom. And I like to say that I caught the trial bug when my first summer in law school, when I did an internship at the Legal Aid Society doing criminal defense work. And I had never had any exposure to that kind of work. And it was just so amazing. It was great to be in the courtroom. I saw trials that were better than TV. I saw real life. I saw people. And I thought, this is where I'd love to be. And so when I clerked for a year for a judge and then entered the Justice Department as an assistant U.S. attorney prosecuting crimes in Washington, D.C. So that was my dream job. I was in the courtroom all the time doing lots of trials. Then I went to the Justice Department and did lots of trials on a national level in the civil rights area. And then I went to The Hague, where I prosecuted trials on the international level. So I really was very fortunate in being able to do those things. When I came back and I moved to New York, then things sort of diversified a bit more. I was in a law firm, as Henry described it, in private practice for a couple of years. Then I was at the New York Stock Exchange as the chief hearing officer doing security regulation. And then I worked for the city of New York as a general counsel for one of the agencies, which is the municipal tribunal. So it again ties into that sense of justice and tribunals and courts. And so then I ended up in the federal court in the Eastern District of New York, based in Brooklyn. And we can talk about that a little bit later, but that's basically been my path.
Great. Now, Joanna, you have the same problem I do, which is you have a last name that's at the very end of the alphabet. I'm relieved that someone has a last name that's after the letter Y, because I always was at the end. So with that, tell us about your career.
Yeah, and I just have to say it's very hard to follow up after Judge Kuo's really interesting and varied career, but I'll go for it. So like Henry, I began my career after law school in private practice. I worked as a litigation associate at a big New York law firm for a couple of years, where I focused on white-collar criminal defense and general commercial litigation. And I would just, lift up Henry's point that that was a really great source of training, understanding, for me, understanding how cases run, but also really deepening sort of the skill set that is applicable to a lot of different legal jobs. After the firm, I worked for 2 years for a judge in the Eastern District of New York. So it's very nice to see Judge Kuo again here. I didn't work for her, but for another judge. But again, I would lift that experience up as amazing legal training as well. You get to see so much of the ins and outs of how cases run, very diverse subject matter, all kinds of plaintiffs and defendants and criminal cases come before the federal courts. And then most recently, following my clerkship, I joined the Brennan Center for Justice, which is a public interest organization affiliated with New York University School of Law. We are part think tank, part public interest litigation shop, part public policy, brainstormers and researchers, and my work there focuses on reforming and strengthening our systems of democracy. I focus on money and politics and elections administration, so very hot topics these days.
You got a lot. You got a lot of work cut out for you, Joanna.
Sure do. It certainly is not abated, but it's a really exciting time to be doing this work. And, as for the path to this particular work, I would say there is no one really representative path to get here. There are many colleagues I have who started where I did and began their careers in litigation practice and law firms. I have colleagues who, however, went from law school to journalism careers or to nonprofits or to governmental organizations. So there's no one path that gets you to working at a think tank. And I'm happy to speak. I can't speak for all public interest organizations, but sort of as a public interest representative for now, I will say that it really depends, I think, the type of work that a person is aiming to do. There are certainly some paths in the public interest world where it's much more common for people to sort of get on a track early on and stick with it. But at least in my line of work, you see people coming from all over the place and bringing different strengths to the table.
Yeah. One of the challenges of the legal profession is it's so diverse, right? And that, you know, that's a challenge of putting a panel together, because you have a judge and in-house counsel, you know, you still be leaving out, you know, 5 other types of law that are kind of typical. Also, it can be a very different experience if you're a large firm or a small firm or so forth. But we're just going to do the best we can. I think the next question is challenging. It's a big picture question, but obviously it varies according to what part of the law you're in. And that is, where is the profession heading? Not just on the positive side, but also the negative side. And, you know, all professions, there's no profession that's perfect, but also professions have good things and bad things happening. You know, I mean, the example is being a doctor. Well, being a doctor 20 years ago is very different from today. You know, you could be your sole practitioner and the country doctor taking care of the people in town, but that increasingly sort of disappeared, for example. Doesn't mean it's better or worse, it's just, it's changed. So if each of you, or any of you, actually, we're now reaching a phase where anyone can talk or decide not to talk. Any comments about, you know, if you were thinking about whether to go into law, what were the things you would like someone to tell you in terms of where the profession is heading, you know, good and bad, right?
Well, Peter, it's hard to predict the future, of course. And I would say, you know, it's a good time to be a lawyer in the sense that there are so many opportunities and there are a lot of changes, but you have to be careful. You can't take a job, number one, just for the money, because it's going to be a very unfulfilling thing. So I would say the one thing that I think is happening, not just in law, but in a lot of areas, is a winner-take-all kind of approach. And so if you become famous and well-known in a particular field for something, you will get all the business, which means that everybody else won't. And so I think that's made it hard that people tend to get specialized. And if you're not the guy in that area, it's harder for you. But having said that, I think there is a lot of room for people to stake out their own place in the legal profession. But the prerequisite for that is that you love your job. I can't emphasize that enough. There are a lot of different things you can do in the law, and you have to pick the area that you want to be in now. You can't always predict what you're going to be doing in 10 or 15 years. The job that you end up in may not exist now, so it's hard for you to plan. But if you pick a job just because you want to get to another job, that is probably not a good idea, because you don't know how long you're going to be stuck in this job. And if you don't love this job now, you won't do a good job, which means you won't get the next job. So I think you really need to pick wisely. And as you pointed out, Peter, know yourself, know your strengths and weaknesses, know the thing that gets you excited, that you love to do. You might like the idea of environmental law, but if you don't like administrative law, then it's probably not a good fit, because a lot of the work there is administrative law. And so you'd really have to understand that particular field, think about it, think about what drives your passions, think about what you want to do on a day-to-day basis, and then do a really good at it. Get the skills necessary to build, and then just go for it in that area. I think if you do that, good things will happen, even if you can't predict what those will be. Yeah.
And I certainly, you know, I mean, the largest number of people who are in law are, you know, working for law firms, obviously, right? There's the sheer numbers. And that one, you know, at least my understanding, I have a lot of people in my family who are lawyers, and they say, you know, the profession has changed, right? It's become much more competitive. A lot of law firms become very large. The job responsibilities and the pressures. It's not like the old partnerships, right, where you were a partner and you stayed until you felt like you didn't want to work anymore. Now it's become a lot more corporate. Do you feel that way? I mean, that's at least what I've been hearing from some of the people I know. Do you feel that way? And all of you've had some experience in private practice, right? So you can all comment about that. Any comments about that?
I mean, I would say just, first of all, lifting up one of the points that Judge Kuo made is that it does feel like the profession is a lot more specialized, even within law firm jobs. So I remember when I was a law firm associate, one of the partners telling me that he was like one of the last great generalists because he was brought up professionally in a generation where you sort of got to do a little bit of everything, and the pressures, as Judge Quo was saying, you like the guy or the gal, like the best one for the job, I think has heightened a lot more. And, you know, in terms of the security of the job, I would also echo your point, Peter, that, you know, there's a lot more pressure, at least I perceived that when I was at the firm, to sort of move up or move out. It's not, you don't have the same sort of, you know, security that folks I've heard said that they had in years past. And then just, you know, culturally, one thing that I wanted to touch on that I don't think is unique to the legal profession, but one thing that seems to be changing this profession and all professions is just the way that we all work, and the way that, you know, email and our smartphones have enabled us to all be kind of like available all the time. And that, just going back to the point about being sure that the thing that you're doing is something that you're engaged in and something that you're really interested in participating in becomes a lot more real when it really, you start to blur those lines between your work and your other life.
Joanna, you mean to say that the legal profession is not a 30-hour-a-week job, I guess? Is that what you're saying?
I hear there are folks out there who can make that happen, but for most of us, that's not the case.
Yeah. Henry, any comment about, you know, the big, you know, the sort of the big picture changes, good and bad?
Yeah, sure. I could talk a little bit about the intersection of technology and the law, and in particular AI, because I have some experience in this field. So, you know, AI is affecting the practice of law, you know, in a similar way that it's affecting other industries. You know, there may be less attorneys in the future doing certain types of tasks. And those tasks I'm thinking of, like, you know, the routine tasks that can be automated. So things that come to mind are discovery, which is basically the process of collecting evidence for, let's say, a litigation or investigation. You know, traditionally, you know, law firms stack lots of attorneys in the discovery process. You know, there's an industry that's trying to automate that process right now. And it may affect, you know, what we've been talking about, you know, the structure of law firms. You know, even routine, you know, preparing, you know, simple legal documents. You just may not need as many, you know, attorneys, particularly junior attorneys, doing these routine tasks. And I think that may also be driving specialization in law firms, because I imagine in the future there'll be a greater need skills that aren't routine, like problem solving skills, figuring out the answer to novel legal questions, even things like management skills, you know, working with clients. So, you know, looking back to the points that, you know, my college, I think, you know, where does, you know, that leaves, you know, someone who's starting out in the practice of law. I think it's important to understand yourself and, you know, kind of understand your niche and, you know, how it drives your interest in the law and figuring out, you know, what the opportunities are in the future that, you know, leverage skills that are not routine and required to do the things that you actually enjoy, you know, that align with your interests. And not to be pessimistic, I mean, you know, technology and law, you know, also drives new opportunities. You know, some of the AI algorithms I'm talking about is actually creating a new industry of jobs within the legal profession as well. So, you know, there's a lot changing, but I think, you know, it comes down to understanding, you know, what your star and how that fits, you know, in, you know, wherever the legal profession goes in the future.
Yeah. Well, as somebody said, when cars came out, it was bad if you were a specialist in making horse buggies, but you know, you could always switch to building cars, right? And so a lot of it is opportunity. Now, the next one is one of my favorite questions, and actually in the legal context, and that is, you know, what are the myths versus realities? And I think, for better or worse, I think the legal profession has more programs on TV than I think any profession. You know, I mean, you know, you can't turn on the TV without, you know, something about law. And you know as well as I that they don't accurately, right, describe what it's like to be a lawyer. I mean, in general, they have all sexy offices and LED screens, and they solve a case like every 15 minutes, or at least before the commercial break, right? Of course, Peggy, I'm sure that Judge Judy is probably an accurate description of what it's like in your courtroom, right?
Sometimes.
Sometimes, right? Exactly. Sometimes. But I think you would admit that there's a lot of myth around, and partly created by TV entertainment, about what it's like to be a lawyer. So, in your mind, what do you think are some of the myths versus realities where there's maybe a disconnect that's important for this audience to understand, right? Of course, Henry, if you have LED screens and all these things, so forth, that's okay. You can declare that you're an exception,
right? I will agree with you. Film and television, I would say, are probably not the best, representations of the actual practice of law. I'm sure there's a long list of reasons why. I'll just point out a few. Cases take a lot of time, and I think even in litigation, you don't spend a lot of time in court at all. Most cases settle, and starting out, when I started out my practice, I also worked in litigation, and can probably count on my hand the number of times I actually went to court. Particularly working in the law firms, you have corporate clients, and they're very risk averse. They don't want to go to court. So the opportunities you're looking for to actually get into court, oftentimes it just doesn't present itself. I'll also say sometimes you work in teams, but sometimes you also work alone. Actually, a lot of the time you work alone. A lot of legal work is performed, like legal research is performed, individually. You need to be able to work independently to make have good judgment and be able to rely on your judgment, to have good communication skills, to present your conclusions either to your partner or client, whoever you're working for. I watching all these legal shows as well, and law does have its moments. I don't want to say it doesn't, but on a typical day-to-day basis, it probably doesn't look like the way it's portrayed in the media.
Oh yeah, and a lot of professions like that, like investment banking that I'm in. It's the same thing. People think it's sexy, and there are parts that are sexy, right? But a lot of it is just grinding out, doing the analysis, and doing work. By the way, the one profession now that I actually think is more distorted by TV than law, there is one, you can't believe it, is forensic science, right? Now with NCIS, Bones, whatever, apparently the applications to forensic, science schools like mushroom, because everyone thinks, it's so sexy. But if you ever been to the New York Police Forensic Lab, I got to tell you, it's just not sexy, right? So, there's a sad example where TV has probably led some people astray. Joanna, you're next. Myth versus realities that you can think of.
I would definitely echo the fact that, unlike TV, when you start at a law firm, you don't show up on your first day and they're like, your trial's in an hour. That's not a thing that happens. And I'll tell you, I can't even count how many times my husband's told me that I'm ruining a show for him because I'm just finding out everything that's wrong about what's going on. As to other myths, I would say that academic background is something that I think matters a little less than people might expect or suggest. I think, when you think of the typical sort of law student, you might think of someone who has a background in poli-sci or econ or history. And there are certainly lots of students with those backgrounds who do go to law school, and those are very valuable academic pursuits to be an asset to your practice as an attorney. But, I was an English major. I know folks who've been very successful lawyers who were engineers or studied various science disciplines. And so I think that, when you think about whether the law is right for you, but you have different sort of academic interests in the background, that I've seen some of like the most amazing like intellectual property lawyers, for example, are people who were previously chemists. So don't rule out law school just because you think you don't have sort of the right academic pedigree, because there are lots of different ways that people can bring their perspectives and their knowledge to the table in really important ways.
Yeah. So Peggy, I'll turn to you. And by the way, my wife was a judge for a period of time, and she insisted that meant everyone in the family had to stand up whenever she came into the room. I don't know. It took us a while to figure out that was a myth. But
that was anyway,
a myth. Yeah. So Peggy, your comment on myths versus realities?
Yeah, I mean, I echo what the other panelists have said. The drama, TV and movies are built on drama, and drama is built on conflict, and human beings are conflict averse. So there's actually very little of the drama that's happening that you see on TV. I think if you were to reduce my year, the sort of dramatic moments in the course of my year into a videotape, it would last about 2 hours. Because the other times are just, they're not boring, but there's not a lot of conflict. There's not a lot happening. There are people talking. And also the role of the judge, in TV, they're banging their gavel. I have a gavel somewhere in my drawer, but I was always told, if you use it, you've already failed, right? Because you need to be able to control the courtroom without doing it. But I've also found that a big part of my job is problem solving. It's not about controlling and telling people what to do. It's sort of bringing the parties together. Like, what's the problem? How are we going to get there? Is it getting to the trial so the jury can make a decision? Is it figuring out how to, move this thing forward or that thing forward or settle a case? So it's drama. It's interesting. There's stuff happening, but it's not visible. And so I think that is a big part of it. The other myth I would say is that you don't have to be a big mouth to be a good lawyer. I think a lot of people are like, oh, I'm too introverted. I don't like public speaking. I shouldn't be a lawyer. There is a place for you in the law. Right. There are lots of people who are excellent writers who, write and then have somebody else make the oral argument, or else, as long as you're limited to what you're speaking on, you can be very good in that kind of public speaking. And there are lots of lawyers who are dealing with contracts or things behind the scenes. So don't be discouraged from pursuing a career just because you don't like public speaking.
By the way, part of what, Joanne, you were touching on so forth, really is a nice segue to the next question, which is, what are the characteristics of people who do well in the legal profession and enjoy it? By the way, they're not necessarily always correlated. I mean, I guess if you're not any good, it'd probably be hard to be happy, but, you could be really good and not happy. And the reason why I mention this is because, for example, in investment banking, I always tell people who are interested, there are certain characteristics. If you don't have it, you're going to have a problem, right? And multitasking, you have work on 5 or 6 things at a time. And some people just aren't that way. They work on one part. They're really, really good, but they really can't work on more than one thing at a time. So I said, if you're not a multitasker, this is just not the right place to be. And what would you list as the 1 or 2 things that you think are the characteristics of people who do well, possibly correlated with being happy? Anyone, this is to any one of you.
Yeah, I think, for the types of jobs that I've had as a lawyer, working as a litigation associate, as a law clerk, and now as someone in public policy, you have to really enjoy research and be willing to sort of sit down and read cases, read statutes, and know that that's going to be a big part of your day. And also some people just don't enjoy it, and that's okay. But for the kind of jobs that I've held, it's really been essential for me that those are things that I really do enjoy doing, and I'm happy to spend a day sort of quietly reading and writing and making written arguments and thinking through things in that way. you know, I also just want to note that, you know, nobody is happy in their job all the time. Like, there are hard days in every profession, in every sort of legal job you might have, any other kind of job outside the law that you might have. But I think this question is an important one, just to, you know, do that kind of soul searching and just thinking critically about what are the things that you want to spend your time doing. Because as Judge Quo said, you know, you may think you're really into environmental law, but if you're not into administrative law and how the inner workings kind of go, like, that might not be the right fit for you.
Yeah. So either you, Henry, or Peggy, or I guess I'm supposed to call her Judge Quo, I guess, right? According to Joanna. All right. Judge Quo, do you have any comments, or Henry?
You're supposed to stand, Peter. Right?
Well, if I stand, you're just going to see my belt, so I guess I'm going to stay seated.
I would say persistence. I think if you give up too easily, you're not going to be successful, either in pursuing a legal argument, like looking for cases, say, there's got to be another way to do this, you know, or pursuing factual investigations to say, maybe there's another witness, maybe there's, you know, something, or reading the papers and digging into the files and being detail oriented and finding that thing, and just going and going and not just saying, oh, well, I guess it's not there. You know, I mean, you have to know when to stop, but I think if you're not a digger, that you probably succeed. Things that are on the surface aren't going to cut it, because the legal profession is complicated. So you have to really understand the different layers and be willing to go there. Henry,
any comments?
Yeah, I definitely want to echo what Peggy said. Law is challenging, but that's not a bad thing. I mean, it could be challenging and good. And so I think, you know, the people I know who, you know, enjoy, you know, the law are people who I think like figuring out problems. They don't shy away from problems. And in particular, you know, I think a lot of problems in the law they're not black and white issues. There's a lot of gray area. You know, classic, legal exercises in law school is to write a legal memo, and you come out with a conclusion. Is it yes, no, or is it maybe? I would say most of the time in practice of law, it's maybe, because if it was yes or no, you probably didn't need a legal memo. So like kind of dealing with these different shades of maybe, I think that might be frustrating for some people. But if you kind of like going through, what Peggy was saying, there's a lot of complexity there, and you kind of have to, take part of the problem, and oftentimes there's no clear-cut solution. I think, if you're comfortable and, you enjoy the challenge of dealing with risk, of dealing with uncertainty, and kind of unpacking problems and figuring them out, I think those are the type of challenges that, someone who enjoys law would find rewarding.
I'm going to switch to another question, which is, having done so many of these Yale career panels for, architecture, music, investment banking, private equity, entrepreneurs, the one thing that's really noticeable, and it's a big positive for the legal profession, is that the number of different kinds of things that people do if they don't stay in the law. It's pretty exceptional when and I think, Joanne, you were talking about that, how people move on to other things. I think probably, the legal profession is probably in the top 10% of all these professions that we've been doing in terms of what people do, go on to do. And, many people stay in the law, right, and then retire, or what they do. I guess it must be something about the legal training and the exposure you get somehow that, one, allows you to have skills to do other things, but also where the other side allows you to do it. You see what I mean? Because you also have somebody who will hire you, so they have to believe that you would be a fit. I mean, do the three of you feel that way? Because you've seen so many of your colleagues, pursue their profession, start out in legal, some stayed, some changed. Do you feel that's true?
Yeah, I definitely do. I mean, I think going to law school helps you to think in a particular way. Some people might say it's rigid, but it helps you to sort of think in a more structured way, like these are the factors to consider when you're making this kind of decision. And it gives you a framework, and it also causes you to think about different things in society. So I think, and the research and writing and speaking skills that you develop, I think, are considered valuable in a lot of other professions. So it's a little bit to go into law school thinking already that you don't want to be a lawyer. But I think that if you're thinking about flexibility in terms of other careers, a legal background doesn't hurt.
Well, I mean, to be honest with you, it's not that you go in profession thinking, how do I get out? But when you decide on profession, it's comforting to know that if it turns out you don't like it, right, that there are other things you can do. I can name 5 professions where trying to get out is almost impossible, right? For a variety of reasons, right? And so, that's just not true of the legal side. Henry or Joanna, any comments about that?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with the points that have been made, and that, it's the skills that you build. It's also the exposure that you can get to other kinds of work doing the work that you do. So, for example, in my line of work at the Brennan Center, we engage with a lot of different community organizations. We engage with charitable foundations who support our work. We work with academics at institutions across the country. And so, many of my colleagues who have left to go on to other things have pursued those kinds of tracks, have gone into, philanthropy or academia or other areas, because, when you're working as a lawyer, you're also exposed to a lot of different people through the cases that you work on or the projects, or just by virtue of the way that your organization operates. So I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind. But I would certainly underscore that if, some folks get the advice that if you're not sure what you want to do for a living, that law school is sort of a safe bet because you'll find employment doing something. And I really don't think that that's a good enough reason to go. I think the people that I know and who I went to law school with who made that decision because they didn't really know what else to do are the people who seem to be the most dissatisfied in their careers.
Yeah. Well, that goes back to what Peggy said, right? Which is it's work is too hard for you not to love what you do, right? And I think that was sort of what you were saying. And by the way, that would apply to any profession, right? It's not legal. Try if you can pursue something that you can fall in love with, right? Because that will make you happy or happier, right? Henry, any comments about this issue?
Yeah, definitely agree with what Joanna said. I think when you're starting out in the process, you don't necessarily need to know exactly what you want to do. I know that I didn't, but I think it's important to consider if you're starting out the process why you're going to law school and what you actually want to do with your degree. Not just going to law school to learn about the legal institution, but to understand what is the value that you expect to get out of having a law degree. I will say that, in terms of, what you do career-wise, I think, we've talked about kind of like some of the more traditional paths. I know a lot of colleagues who transitioned from, legal to the business side. And when I was at the technology startup that I worked at, I would say about half the management had law degrees, but they were not practicing law. They were not acting in a legal capacity. His running joke was that I was the only person, at those meetings with a law degree who's actually practicing law. So it is possible other things with your law degree. But I think, that being said, I think, if you're starting out the process, it's a long journey. When you go to law school, it's 3 years, and then, a lot of people incur debt. It takes many years to get out of that debt. It's just important to, I think, kind of understand what is the value of, having a law degree. What is that, and what do you think you want to do with that in the future? And it may not necessarily be practicing law, but I think, the people I know who had a better sense of that enjoyed law school better and enjoyed the practice of law better.
Right. Well, I think Peggy answered this question, but she can still answer it again, which is, what is it about the part of the law that you're involved with that each of you fell in love with? And Peggy partially answered before, even though I hadn't asked the question, but she can answer it again. So, Joanna?
Oh gosh, I guess there are a few things that I really like about not just the job that I do, but all the jobs that I've done is that you're constantly learning. Some folks might think that you go to law school and sort of, stuff everything in your brain and you come out and you know how to be a lawyer and you know all the things that you need to know to practice law. But, as I mentioned before, so much of my work is just researching new areas of law, new fact patterns, new policies. And I think that spirit of just like constant learning is one that I really, really enjoy about my job. Like, I know things today that I didn't know 3 days ago. And that's always the thing that's a constant about the work that I get to do, which makes it really exciting. And, just going back to the point that Henry made before about, you have to sort of enjoy tough questions and, gray areas. That's something for me that I really enjoy and get to wrangle with all the time. So.
Yeah, and the thing I'll add to that is I think what I really enjoy is how law facilitates emerging technologies. So I mentioned before, when I went to law school, I didn't really know exactly what I wanted to do, but I kind of knew that I really enjoyed technology and innovation, and I kind of wanted to stay connected with that, even in the practice of law. So that's what led me to intellectual property law. And now at American Express, I although that's a part of my practice, I'm not really an IP attorney anymore. Kind of my career has kind of changed and it's kind of evolved. But the fact that I was interested in that, I think that was kind of my grounding in law, and that's the reason why the point that's been we've been kind of circling back on learning and discovering new things and figuring out problems. That's what's always made it engaging, interesting for me.
And just to come around full circle, Peter, I ended up back in the courtroom, which is where I wanted to be.
Yeah.
And like Joanna was saying, I learn something every day. I'm a generalist, right, which is so rare. And I never know what kind of case is going to come in. I'm dealing with areas of the law that I had never dealt with before, and I'm dealing with people, with lawyers and non-lawyers, and I never know what's going to happen, and that makes it really interesting, really exciting, really engaging. There's a lot of problem solving. I feel like I can make a difference by helping people solve their problems or make decisions that serve justice to the best I can, and so that's just a great place to be. I'm very, very fortunate to be here.
One comment I make to all of the attendees, I strongly encourage you not only to try to make sure you understand yourself in a candid way, but talk to people who are in the profession, talk about what they do every day, and really try to understand. Try to put yourself in their shoes and say, how would I feel like doing that? And it's wonderful how we have 3 Yale graduates on the panelists, and they're giving back in this panel to their society, to young people by doing this. And you'd be amazed at how generous, for example, most of the audience here is mainly Yale students or graduates, how generous people are, even if they don't know you, to just sort of help you understand what the career is all about and so forth. So, it's a lot better to learn and get excited about what you're doing by virtue of having enough information than to find out later, right? It'd be painful to find out after you've gone through 3 years of law school, right? That would be pretty painful and expensive, right? Exactly. I, for example, was thinking about business versus law, and I attended classes at Harvard Business School, Harvard Law School, whatever, and I decided I liked law, but I liked being a business person who understood enough about law to at least understand the concepts and know when to bring in a lawyer. And so instead of going to law school, I went to business school. but I took some business law courses, which really helped me. And every day as an investment banker, I'm looking at legal documents every day. I'm not acting as a lawyer, but that's the right balance for me. But that's because I talked to people and really thought it through as to what really was right, for me, right? And that's the most important thing. So last thing, I encourage people to ask questions, and I don't see too many of them. There is one question, which, do we need to take a seat at a panelist table? Absolutely not. If you don't want to talk to any panelists, we have tables where you can talk to other people. So that's a question I can answer, right? So any questions for the audience, or should I turn to the
Peter,
last?
I see a question about life work balance.
Oh, there we go. There we go. All right. I see it. It's under the question category. Okay. So the question is, thank you all, ! I'm in my mid-30s and have a family. Do you see space in the legal profession for people who prioritize their families, such as via part-time work, alternative schedules?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that different employers treat schedules and the work structure differently. So, at the law firm that I came from, there was a part-time track for folks who, for one reason or another, if it's because they had children or because they were caring for another family member or something like that, had the option to do that. And, folks that I work with now who work part-time as well. I can't speak sort of for the profession as a general matter, but I think, it depends on the particular employer that you're working with. It's definitely, I think, something that more people seem to be calling for, especially in this pandemic age of working, where parents have had to make so many choices, and not just parents, but, people who are caring for other people in their lives have to make sometimes very difficult just between their professions and their personal lives.
Yeah.
Peggy or Henry, any comments?
Yeah, and I hope that's one of the, so one of the things I think we learned from this past year is that a lot of work that was, used to be done in the office can actually be done remotely with no loss of efficiency, or collaboration with colleagues. So I hope that that may be an emerging trend in the practice. Is that, and this has been the case for years, is that you don't necessarily need face time in the office. That a lot of things could be managed, over phone calls and video conferencing and through correspondence. And I hope that after this past year, that's an emerging trend for the profession.
Here's a second question. Oh, I'm sorry, Peggy. Do you have something?
No, I was just going to add, I hope so that this trend continues, and I think that people can no longer say that if you're working from home, you're not as productive. And it's just a question of what value is there in having the employee physically in a particular space. And also the travel that people used to have to is no longer necessary. I've had court appearances with people from all over the country. It doesn't really matter anymore, so a lot of that time can be cut out. But I do think that different employers are different. And also different types of law lend themselves more to flexibility. If you're doing contract review, that's probably a little bit more flexible than if you're in litigation where, the trial's coming up, you can't, it's hard to focus on anything other than the trial. And so there are ways to make it work. You just might not be able to make everything work at that particular moment in your career.
So Peggy, one question. There was that famous viral thing where there was a Zoom court session, and that was a cat. Yes. Have you had any lawyers turn into cats by mistake?
I wish. No, I haven't.
Here's another question. Do you recommend taking time off between undergraduate and law school? I've heard mixed responses.
I have somewhat strong feelings about this. I took off, and I mean I shouldn't have said that because, everyone makes the decision that's right for them. And there may be some value you could argue of, if you've known since you were 6 years old, you wanted to be able to go out there and keep up the momentum. That was the advice that I got from my parents because they were afraid that I would never go to graduate school if I started doing something else. I took 3 years between graduation and going to law school, and I'm eternally grateful that I did. And it's advice that I give to students that I talk to now that, for personal but also practical professional reasons, it'd be a really good idea. One thing that I noticed when I was in law school is that the people who had been out for a while had a much easier time adjusting and a much better sort of outlook and perspective on the fact that they were going to law school. Some folks who had gone straight through, I think, mistakenly thought that it was going to be a 3-year extension of college, and law school could not be more different than college. And that, I think, was just a rude awakening and tough adjustment from undergrad to professional school. But on a professional note, just, sort of the strategic advantage is that when you go to law school and you're applying for your summer positions and applying for employment after you graduate, employers are going to be comparing folks who have a little more world experience to those who just haven't been out there. And, I've seen it happen that it's just often the folks who've garnered some professional experience, who have built their toolbox of skills a little bit more and just have a better sense of like what it is to be an employee out there in the world, have an easier time, I think, navigating those. But it's a very personal choice. So I think that there are advantages either way, but I think that on balance, I'm really glad that I took some time in between.
Any last comments from Peggy or Henry?
Yeah, I went straight through, and it was because I come from an immigrant family where it's like, what are you doing in your gap year? Just go. Start your career, right? You can figure it out afterwards, but then with a law degree. And so it depends. I don't know what I would have done in that year. And if I had just taken the job for the sake of taking a job, I'm not sure how that would have benefited me. On the other hand, I do agree with Joanna that my classmates who did take some time off seem to be have a little more context for the things we're learning. But it's there's no right answer. Sorry not to be able to clarify things for you.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's an individual choice. It depends on the person. So I did spend several years before law school, kind of pursuing interests and jobs. And I thought it was helpful for me just to get perspective on, outside of kind of my academic interest, what was important to me in terms of, the career that you end up in, your work environment, your colleagues, what it is that you're looking for, which helped me later on when I was, trying to figure out which law firm and, which companies I wanted to work at, but also just helped me prepare for law school. So it was helpful for me, but yeah, I think, it depends on the individual.
Now, we always promise that we would start on time and end on time. There are additional questions, actually some good questions from people. But the good news is you can ask the questions directly at the table. So what I'm going to do, first of all, I'm going to thank the 3 panelists for really doing a wonderful job of helping, getting through these questions. They're really important questions when you're thinking about whether you want to be in the legal profession. I want to thank you, and I think diversity was very important because the 3 of you have very different careers, and it's very important. Now, I want to remind all of you that in a couple of seconds, when we take you all off, take the panelists off the stage, you're going to miraculously find yourself in a virtual ballroom. Take a look. You can see tables of the individual panelists, but also there are open tables where you can just sit and chat with other people. So with that, I want to again thank you, and we're going to have some additional programs in the summer, so watch for that when we'll send out notices, and then we'll start up in a serious note in the fall. So with that, I look forward to seeing all of you at the ballroom.